introduction, and thank you for having me here today. I'm really happy that I can share my work from Colombia, which is a very different context from most of you who are talking about Asia. And thank you, Ellen, for organizing this great conference. So the work I'm going to present today is from research I did in 2012 and 2013 in 2 fertility centers in Bogota, Colombia. Bogota is the capital of Colombia. I'll give a bit more context about Colombia itself as I go through the presentation. And this is data that I did for this is research I did for my doctoral thesis, but I didn't necessarily analyze this data at that time, so it's a bit newer. So in her seminal work, Raina Rath proposes the term moral pioneers for women who traversed uncharted territories as they engage with new reproductive technologies, specifically amniocentesis, to make decisions about the fate of their pregnancies based on available long-standing resources. These women use their own desires, notions of family and disability, and perceptions of the technology in deciding whether to terminate a pregnancy that science determined to be effective. Her findings point to a cultural diversity of both problems and solutions arising from these technologies. A range of possibilities that new biotechnologies present creates hope for some and profound unease for others. A growing body of literature has looked at kind of the moral decision-making that patients make in the realm of deciding whether or not these technologies bring hope or whether they bring unease and how that unease is perceived. But there's less research on the perception of medical professionals. And so what I'm going to talk about today is a context in which Colombia, where there isn't much regulation. So doctors really have to make ethical, moral, and social decisions about the boundaries of their practice kind of through their everyday on their own. So I'm not going to go into so much detail because we've been talking about this for the past 2 days, the fact that there is great diversity in the kind of the ways that technologies are received in different places, and I don't think that only means coming from the West to the global South, if you want to look at it that way, but also within countries you also have diversity. And there's a lot of different reasons behind that, and we have seen how different cultural notions kind of shape the regulations that are created or the regulations that are not created. One thing I do want to point out is this discussion that Damatov presents in her research in Vietnam around abortion practices. And she shows that doctors felt it was their responsibility to determine the ambiguous lines between mild and severe fetal abnormalities in order to provide women and families with healthy children. They did not do this necessarily to meet the state's demands for demographic goals. So thus, the doctor's decision-making and the information they provided matched that of the kind of the regulations set by the state, but they were doing it for different reasons. And that's something that I found also in my research in Colombia, that even though doctors might be, their practice might evolve in the same way as another doctor's or something that's happening in another country, but that doesn't mean that they were necessarily doing it for the same reasons or that their logic behind it was the same. So just a bit about Colombia, because I imagine it is a context that most of you don't know much about. There it is on the map. It's in the northern part of South America. It's a developing South American country. It is the 4th largest economy in South America, but it has been plagued with a civil war for over 2 centuries, about 3 centuries now. And even though situations are improving and a peace agreement was signed in 2016, there is still a lot of civil violence within the country. It is very much a pronatalist society and a Catholic society. And these factors are really important when you're talking about laws around reproduction, specifically around abortion, for instance, which has been brought into debates about assisted reproduction. A new constitution was signed in 1991, and what's important about that is that it did state some regulations around the status of children that were born from reproductive technologies. As well as following that, there was a new health reform in 1993, which kind of created a form of universal health care. It's very complicated. It's nothing like the system in Taiwan, but it is the idea that everybody should have access to free health care. So I'm going to discuss a little bit about the legal framework that does exist. So there are very limited regulations. The ones that are very clear and transparent in the laws are the fact that clinics have to be licensed and registered as medical institutions. So that means they go through some form of accreditation by the state. Laboratories are monitored for good practice. I was explaining that on occasion somebody from the state will come to check that the laboratories are being maintained in the proper way. In the 10 months I was doing research, I never met anybody from the state to check these things, so I don't know if that actually happens. Fertility specialists must be accredited. They have to go through some type of training. Training is not available in Colombia, so they all go abroad. There are specific legal regulations that forbid the manipulation of embryos and the development of designer babies, and there are some regulations on gamete donation. These pertain to the fact that a gamete donor should be at least 18 years old. They should be screened for infectious diseases and undergo physical, genetic, and psychological examinations. That gamete bank should be anonymous, and the donor should be registered with an identification number. But that doesn't mean that you can't have known donation. That's also a practice. And in general, aligning with regulations for the donation of biological materials in general, donation should be altruistic and voluntary. There's no laws regulating who can access assisted reproduction. To say that so lesbian couples can access ARTs, single women can access ARTs. Gay men are precluded because surrogacy is not legal. It's a legal gray area, which if you want more information on that, I can tell you that later, but that's kind of complicated. So there has been 2 times in the past 20 years where there's been, where assisted reproduction has come to the Congress and it has been debated. The first time was in 2003 and 2004. And this was an attempt to further regulate the use of ARTs and limit the types of treatments that are available and limit who can access these technologies. So there was really 2 groups of lobbyists that came forward, and they were very much influenced by a pro-Catholic kind of sentiment, and the fact that we need to really limit who is using these technologies. We really need to limit what is happening in these clinics. None of the laws that were proposed none of the bills that were proposed got turned into law. So nothing really came of that time in 2003 and 2004. More recently, in 2015 to 2017, these debates came to the Congress again, but this time in regards to this idea around universal health care and the fact that infertility is a disease and it should be recognized by the state as a disease and it should be covered by the universal health care system. This did get passed both in the House and in the Senate, but then the president at the time, President Santos, vetoed the bill. And he said, echoing an earlier stance that the government took in 1998, he said, "The mandatory health plan is not obligated to contribute to the diagnosis, treatment, or rehabilitation of sicknesses that are considered cosmetic, aesthetic, or sumptuary, or that are a complication resulting from these treatments or processes." So in other words, he was saying that these are treatments that are unnecessary and we cannot afford them. And that was really his basis, was saying that the state cannot afford to offer these treatments and that it would bankrupt the universal health care system. Since then, I recently learned that this has been now brought to the Constitutional Court and they are reopening the debate. So there is a chance in the future that it could become part of the universal health care system, but that is still to be determined. So the outcome of this is really that access to ARTs are greatly limited. They're only available in the private healthcare sector, and they are very expensive. These prices are probably not correct today. These are prices from when I was doing my research 6-7 years ago, and also exchange rates have changed. But you can see that if artificial insemination costs $900 and ICSI with donor eggs costs over $5,000, but the average person only makes $262 a month, that really the majority of the population cannot access these technologies. Colombia does have extreme wealth disparity, but that still means that the average person doesn't have access to these technologies. Furthermore, it means that doctors are primarily regulating the treatments that they offer because there really are not many laws available. So Dr. Herrera, a fertility specialist and owner of one of the clinics I was doing my research at, said, if we have a very conservative government, it is possible that we will not be able to do the things we want to do. Often unnecessary laws are created, but important factors are passed over. Because of lack of knowledge, people who regulate these practices do not understand our work. In other words, at this time, in 2013, these doctors were very happy that there weren't really any laws that were governing what they could do, because of the fact that they were worried that any laws that were created would really limit their practices. A bit more about the context. So not only has there aren't really any regulations about ARTs, but also the government has not been involved, obviously, in developing any of these centers. So this has really been a doctor-initiated or fertility specialist-initiated arrival of ARTs into Colombia. So it was explained to me that a workshop held in Barranquilla, which is one of the biggest cities in the country, in 1982 was kind of where it all started as far as having assisted reproductive technologies in Colombia. And soon after that, two primary clinics opened, and one in Bogota and another one in Medellin. And from there, numerous other clinics have opened. There's approximately 50-some clinics today, but only 13 of them are registered with this network called the Latin American Network of Assisted Reproduction. So there really isn't any kind of public forum available where I can get access to the actual number of clinics that are available. This number comes from a pharmaceutical rep who provides the majority of hormones that are used in these treatments. Soon after the first clinics were developed, the first IVF baby was born in January of 1985. This is arguably the first Latin American ART baby, but there are plenty of other countries that claim that they have that baby, also born in 1985. As I mentioned before, that there is not medical training in Colombia, so doctors are going abroad. Most of them are going to other Latin American countries, Europe or North America, as well as the fact that these technologies are all being imported primarily from North America. And last, these clinics have all been self-funded or self-initiated. In other words, these doctors have put large sums of money into starting these clinics, or they have found investors to do that for them. So you obviously have this confrontation of offering medical practice in a very privatized setting where there's a lot of money that needs to be made to make them sustainable. So this creates competition between the clinics. And this creates also a lack of standardization across treatment practices. As Dr. Herrera again said, we are all jealous of the other. There is collaboration at conferences and other academic events, but that is the extent of it. And Dr. Samuels, an embryologist, said, clinics do not interact with other clinics. There's a lack of trust. It is competition. So they are not collaborating. They are competing with each other. There is no standardization as far as the practices they can use. So essentially, doctors are using their own decision-making, their own morals, their own ethics, and their own understanding of what is their social responsibility to decide what treatments they're going to offer to their patients. Even though doctors are using their own kind of sentiments in making their treatment decisions, I found it very interesting that it was apparent that they weren't only making treatment decisions based on money. They didn't only seek to make a profit from the treatments they were offering, which I found very surprising. And then they often talked about hard decisions they had to make and decisions that they felt very uncomfortable having to make. And one of the rounds in which this was around denying women treatment or asking them to forego treatment or to delay treatment. As far as delaying treatment or denying them treatment, that had to do often around issues of age, their relationship status. Not saying that they were single or that they were homosexual, that wasn't the issue, but if it seemed that there was some kind of functional problem with the couple, then they might ask the couple to delay treatment and see a psychologist or not to go through treatment at all. And then there's also things around the physical health of the women. So some obese women were asked to forego treatment until they got their weight under control. So Dr. Herrera again is saying, there are couples that one can perceive are not very functional, but at the moment that you need to reject someone, this is complicated. because you have to think that they do not have a psychological problem, but they are very dysfunctional. So in this case, we prefer to work more with the psychologist before the couple seeks treatment. And so in this way, these doctors are really using their authority and their position in these clinics as the kind of the gatekeepers to these technologies to determine who can access these treatments. Another situation where you saw this is when you had low egg or embryo quality after a treatment had already been started, and that a doctor would then say, we're not going to continue moving forward. So Dr. Mabel, another fertility specialist and owner of the clinic, said, at some clinics, they may choose to transfer embryos that were not of good enough quality, but for what reason? Just to make the woman realize in 10 to 15 days that she is not pregnant, giving the patient hope while she waits for the pregnancy results. That is why I chose not to transfer any of the embryos, because emotionally it is better for the patient. It is a hard decision to make, but one I have to make. In another situation, he explains, sometimes I have to make hard decisions, but I want to do what is best for my patient in all regards. This process is emotionally and psychologically difficult for the patients. Thus, I need to do what is best for them in all these respects, medically, emotionally, and psychologically. There was an exception to certain people at the clinic who did not feel that they could really intervene in kind of these more social or, I guess you can also say physical issues that may cause a fertility specialist to tell a patient that they couldn't go through treatment. And that was in the case of embryologists or nurses, or at one clinic there was a doctor in training who was there. And they felt that they did not have the authority, it seemed like, to tell patients or to try to tell even the fertility specialists that these couples shouldn't go through treatment at this time. But that's not to say that they didn't, but they felt, it was very apparent in their narrative that they felt very uncomfortable in these situations. So another example of how doctors, of issues that doctors had to deal with that they weren't always prepared to deal with, had to deal with donor conception practices. So one of the issues was paying donors. As I already said, donation is supposed to be altruistic and voluntary, but ultimately female donors or egg donors were paid. And I know that this happens in a lot of countries where someone is compensated for their eggs, for their time, for the loss of work, for transportation costs of these things. But the thing that I feel makes this slightly different is that even though the amount of money wasn't that much, it was usually around $250 to $300 US, the fact was that couples, fertility specialists, and the donors all recognized this as a payment. They didn't recognize it as compensation. And this was seen as being problematic by some of the doctors that I worked with. Another issue was, sorry, I lost my place here. To eliminate government controls around the use of donors. So some clinics chose to kind of create additional regulations that they followed. For instance, Dr. Herrera, she said it's not important. It is important that there are specific controls, real controls over how many donations a donor makes, and of these donations, how many are successful pregnancies. These are things that we regulate, in other words, the clinic regulates, because it is important, but the government really doesn't care that we do these things. Another issue around donation came with the fact of using known donors versus anonymous donors. One of the clinics that I was doing my research at, one doctor allowed known donation and the other doctor did not, which created issues. And another clinic, the doctor allowed known donation, but then sometimes he was confronted with issues of questions of a known donor that he found to be problematic. One specific case was a woman who had remarried, wanted to use the eggs of her older daughter. And Dr. Mabel explained, I can't do that. The child, he would be her grandchild, but she would be his mother. It is too complicated. I just can't do that. But because he didn't have actual regulations put in place, I think he also struggled with the fact of how do I tell the patient that, because I have allowed other women to use a family member, but just not that type of family member, or that specific family member. Another place that raised issues was around cryopreservation. And this had a lot to do with the significance of embryos and what the difference between what patients, the significance patients gave to embryos and the significance that doctors gave to embryos. So for the doctor, the embryo was potential. It was a potential for another treatment cycle if the current cycle did not, it was not successful. And that's clearly stated by Dr. Cortero, who said, if we say, for example, that treatment is only 50% successful, then there's a 50% chance that the couple could use those embryos in the next cycle. So for him, it was just plain mathematics. If you cryopreserve eggs, you're going to have a better chance of getting pregnant at a later time. But for patients, they didn't, there was this feeling that if I cryopreserve my eggs, number one, it's going to cost me more money, and I've already paid so much money for this treatment. So they thought about the cost. Then they also thought, what do I do if I cryopreserve this egg and or these embryos and I don't want to use them in the future? Then again, I waste them, and what do I do with them? And then there was also this sentiment then around the other options of if you didn't cryopreserve, you could donate them to science or donate them to another couple. And I didn't meet any couples who were willing to do that because of the fact that they didn't want their embryos, or they didn't want their genetics going to somebody that they didn't know. So for couples, the most logical choice often was to just disregard them. But this was also a practice that was seen as difficult by some of the clinicians. Particularly the embryologists often talked about the fact that these are living substances. They understood that they didn't necessarily have the potential if they weren't transferred to become a living being, but they were living substances. And Dr. Samuel's narrative here is very clear. He says, in order to give these embryos dignity, because they are these living substances, we let them go slowly, in a non-painful way, as if they could feel, but they do not have a central nervous system. So I know they are not feeling pain, but they are cells. They are living things, they are alive. So we give them a little dignity as far as we are concerned, letting them go in the incubator. So even though the embryologists knew that they couldn't necessarily intervene and they couldn't do anything with these embryos, this was still a hard decision for them to make, or a hard practice for them to have to be constantly letting embryos go, as they put it, in the incubator when they saw them to have so much potential. But then, of course, the alternative of cryopreservation also raised a lot of issues in the fact that there's a lack of storage facilities. Both the clinics, they talked about the fact that our nitrogen tanks are overflowing with embryos, and we don't have anything to do. We don't know what to do with them. There's often the issue that couples would decide that they didn't want to thaw their eggs, but they didn't want to use they didn't want to thaw their embryos, they didn't want to use their embryos, but they also didn't want to pay for them anymore, so they just stopped paying, and they told the clinic, they didn't give the clinic an answer what to do with them. But because there's no legislation, clinics do not want to thaw them. So they just stay there in the incubator. And obviously this is not only an issue in Colombia, as most of us probably know, this is a global issue that is not being discussed. So in conclusion, I see this context of limited regulation, competition between the private medical sectors, private medical system, and a lack of collaboration to kind of impact the ART industry in Colombia in three different ways. First, the impact it has on the medical system, and this is the fact that there is variation across clinics, which increases, I think, patients' willingness and ability to shop around for multiple clinics, or for multiple treatment cycles, going from one clinic to the other, and never having anybody tell them really that they should stop going through treatment. Also, this lack of competition and collaboration between doctors, I think that it also increases the cost of treatment because there's no standardization around treatment costs. It also impacts the patient-doctor relationship in the sense that doctors are making decisions about who should access treatment and at what stage women should be able to access treatment as far as their bodies or their age or their relationship status. Or making decisions about when they should forgo treatment, when they should delay treatment or forgo treatment once they've already started, which obviously can create some confrontation between doctors and patients. And it can also, that itself can also send patients to other clinics. And last, it's really, it's creating this disjuncture between, there's this relationship between the doctor and society. In the sense that as the doctors are making these decisions, for instance, making decisions around what kind of donor materials can be used, who can donate to who, these kind of decisions, they're ultimately making decisions about what is the proper type of family, who should be parents, and to an extent, what are the meanings of these embryos and these gametes that we have, that we're using. So this lack of government involvement, both legally and financially, creates this context that then these doctors have to regulate on their own. And I kind of see this to reflect the work by Livingston and her idea of improvised medicine. Her work is on the use of, on oncology practices in Botswana in the early 2000s, and the lack of expertise, technologies for diagnosing cancer, as well as medications to treat cancer, and how doctors are often having to decide, and ultimately, who is going to live and die. In this case, it is this context of lack of collaboration, lack of regulation, and this competition that is happening that is creating this context in which doctors have to decide almost on a daily basis what kind of treatments they are going to offer. So I'm proposing this to be called Improvising.